Hello, I'm Jeff Thielman, the President and CEO of the International Institute of New England, and I want to welcome you to our town hall webinar, What's at Stake? Immigration Policies in an Election Year. As we all know, we are less than a week away from the presidential election, and immigration has taken a center stage in this campaign season. Much of the debate has been filled, unfortunately, with false claims and fear-mongering. During our webinar, our staff will unpack the immigration platforms of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. We'll talk about what's actually going on at the US-Mexico border, which my colleagues and I visited this past summer with the US Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. We'll talk about the latest changes to the federal asylum policy and changes to the CHNV program, Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan humanitarian parole program, which impacts thousands of our clients, literally. We're going to be talking about how we advocate at IINE for the rights of refugees and immigrants and what you can do to support these efforts. We'll be sharing a recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides, and we'll do that by email later this week. So next is our mission statement. So we always begin by centering ourselves. We begin all of our staff meetings and organizational meetings by centering ourselves in this mission to remind ourselves of why we're here and what we do. Our mission, as you see on the screen, is to create opportunities for refugees and immigrants to succeed through resettlement, education, career advancement, and pathways to citizenship. In the past year, the International Institute of New England provided life-changing services to more than 20,000 newly arrived individuals throughout New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and in New York City metro area, where we support unaccompanied children. It's the most people we have served in as far as we can go back in time. Our work is only possible with the support of a community. We are lucky to partner with healthcare centers, school districts, employers, and community organizations throughout New England. No resettlement agency can do its work alone. And we're very glad to have the support of volunteers, donors, and community members like those of you watching this afternoon. Next slide gives you an overview of our theory of change. This guides our work. It guides our decision-making on what kind of programs we pursue. We've grown quite a bit over the past several years, and we've done so within this theory of change. It's designed to provide persecuted and displaced individuals with the support they need to start strong in our communities and with time to give back to their new home. We welcome refugees and immigrants. We help them to stabilize, as you see on the screen, through English classes and employment support. And we support their longer-term integration through civic engagement and our immigration and legal services program. Clients enter and re-enter our continuum of care at various points in their journey in the US. Sometimes people are in every single stage of that continuum. Sometimes people, we resettle and then we see them again when they're becoming citizens. Our goal is to help each person and family become self-sufficient as quickly as possible. There is no strong safety net in the US, no self-sufficiency. So self-sufficiency is absolutely critical for survival in this country. So today you're going to hear from several of us. I'll be joined by my colleagues, our Senior Vice President and Chief Advancement Officer, Alexandra Weber, and our Director of Policy and Advocacy, Bill Gillett. Zan is going to provide an overview of our advocacy efforts from when our Boston office opened 100 years ago until today. We're in our 100th year of service here to the city of Boston. We'll also discuss federal immigration policy and what Zan saw and I saw on our trip during the trip this summer to the US-Mexico border. We visited both sides of the border. Bill will then join to provide a deeper understanding of the immigration landscape in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Bill previously served as the chair of the IINE Board of Directors. He was the chair when I was hired. He hired me to be the CEO, and he rejoined our organization earlier this year in a new role overseeing our advocacy efforts. We'd like you to use the Q&A feature if you can to submit any questions throughout the program. Dan, Bill, and I will be available to answer them following the presentation. So now I want to turn over to my colleague, Alexandra Zan Weber, our Senior Vice President and Chief Advancement Officer, who has been with this organization for more than 15 years now.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful to be with you this afternoon. Like Jeff said, I want to start before we launch into the election by highlighting that 2024 is an important year for the Institute, not only because of this monumental election on Tuesday, but because it marks our 100th anniversary of our Boston program. When our Boston office opened its doors in 1924, it did so with what was really a radical belief at the time, that not only should immigrants be welcomed and supported in the US, but that their unique cultures and customs should be preserved and celebrated rather than absorbed through forced assimilation. That was a very new idea at the time. And I'm pointing this out because it's important to remember that despite the wild political shifts over the last 100 years, IINE today is not only still operating, but stronger and larger than ever, in part because we have never only been a service provider. Since our earliest years, we've worked to advocate for the welcome and integration of immigrants. And let me give you a few examples. In 1943, we lobbied against xenophobic Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1945, we advocated for greater rights and equality in the workplace for immigrants through the Fair Employment Act. In 1961, we sent a persuasive letter to President Kennedy pushing for comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level, which was later realized under President Lyndon Johnson. In 1987, an IAB staff member founded the Massachusetts Immigrant Advocacy Coalition, which today is the largest coalition in New England promoting the rights and integration of immigrants and refugees. In 2001, we opened the Dreams of Freedom Museum as an investment in educational and cultural programming promoting immigrant integration in the city of Boston. And then recently, in 2017, we launched Suitcase Stories, which is a program that performs all over New England and beyond and explores immigration through the art of storytelling. And all that work brings us to today, when we're less than a week out from the presidential election, and so much in that election is at stake for our communities. We're hosting the conversation today because we feel it's critical to offer our perspective and experiences on the vastly different approaches the two presidential candidates bring to the realm of immigration policy. So first, we've got Donald Trump. We've experienced a Donald Trump presidency already. Between 2017 and 2021, the US refugee resettlement program was almost completely dismantled under his administration. Trump's first executive order was a travel ban that targeted citizens of majority Muslim countries and halted the resettlement of all Syrian refugees. Throughout his time in office, his administration worked tirelessly and methodically to restrict immigration to the United States, and specifically to place greater burdens on asylum seekers to prove their claims, to issue new rules for immigration judges aimed at making claims harder to win, using memos and legal mechanisms to narrow the eligibility for asylum. And in 2020, as the coronavirus pandemic raged, he used a little-known public health rule to turn back virtually anyone seeking asylum at the southern border, including separating families and children. So we know previous Trump administration efforts to restrict legal immigration were very successful, and limiting both legal and unauthorized immigration has become his brand. He's recently claimed that admitting immigrants to the US will create or turn the US into a garbage can, quote, garbage can for the whole world. And he's also been very specific about his plans if he wins a second term. And these have included overseeing the largest deportation of immigrants in US history, which would, on all estimates, cost nearly $1 trillion just to remove people from this country, restoring the Muslim and other travel bans that he enacted in his first administration, continuing to expand the US border, Mexico border wall, and suspending the refugee resettlement program entirely. Moving on to Kamala Harris. Though not with a perfect record, in the past 4 years, the Harris-Biden administration has restored and strengthened controlled immigration pathway programs. They've reversed travel bans and family separation policies. They raised the refugee admission ceiling to 125,000. And as a country, this past year, we welcomed for the first time in 30 years, over 100,000 refugees to the US. They've committed to protecting dreamers. Harris herself is focused on addressing root causes of poverty in Central America. And at the same time, the Biden administration introduced unprecedented levels of restrictions on asylum. This campaign season, immigration's been used as a political football with little basis in facts to manipulate voters. And even Harris herself has campaigned on even more sweeping restrictions on asylum, which we'll go into in greater depth later on in the program. But first, let's take a closer look at some of the current policy platforms that both candidates are using. One of the most frequent topics of conversation this election season has been the US-Mexico border. We've repeatedly heard that immigration is out of control, that our border's overrun, and it's damaging the nation's security and economy. But what we asked ourselves is, what is actually going on? So over this summer, IINE accompanied the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants on a trip to the U.S.-Mexico border to learn more about the conditions firsthand for ourselves and how current policies are impacting the many asylum seekers trying to claim asylum in the U.S. And also to better understand the experience of so many of the Haitian population that IINE has welcomed over the past several years to Massachusetts and New Hampshire. But before I continue, let's just make sure that we all have the same definition and understand who asylum seekers are. So we have a quick quiz tonight that will pop up on your screen momentarily that we'd like you to just quickly respond to. And I'm going to give you a few minutes, maybe half a minute to answer. The question for the audience is, what must individuals prove to be granted asylum in the US? And the responses are, they need to prove they're fleeing poverty. They need to prove they're fleeing general violence. They need to prove they have a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, or they need to prove that they need to reunite with family members in the US. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer. And I think we have responses. I don't see the tally yet, but if you have answered number 3, those who claiming asylum need to prove they have a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group or political opinion, then you are correct. Though some asylum seekers have all of these experiences that are outlined above, that is the technical definition of asylum and the criteria you need to prove to meet that claim. So in all, the burden of proof and applying for asylum is very, very difficult and expensive and complex. It actually takes an average of 54 months, which is about 4.5 years, for the process from petitioning for asylum to seeking out asylum to be granted. And asylum is actually granted to very few people seeking protection in the US. The number of the success rate is around 45% for every person. So now I'm going to bring Jeff back to provide a few more details about the current state of the southern border.
Thanks, Anne, and welcome back to everybody. Thanks for taking the quiz. So as Anne mentioned, in July of this year, 2024, she and I, Christina Duran, and one of our colleagues from the U.S. Committee for U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, Erin Nujmadian Esquihada, who is featured there in that photo. We all visited the southern border with a few other staff from USCRI, our national office. We visited El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez. These are 2 border communities And there's actually very close relationships between folks and organizations on both sides of that border. The reason why we went to the Mexican border was because we have served over 14,000 Haitian immigrants in the past 18 months, and many of those folks came through the southern border. In addition, this past year, we served 937 unaccompanied children. We have a program that reunites these kids with family members in the Northeast and New York, as I mentioned earlier, and throughout New England. We have 37 staff in this program, and these kids have come to the southern border on their own. And so we wanted to understand what they went through to try to cross the southern border. And so we were there to understand our clients' experiences. We spoke with aid organizations and government officials. We had the chance to interview and speak with several asylum seekers from Central and South America and learn more about their journeys. The folks that we met had fled very dangerous situations in their home countries, and they were hoping to find safety and opportunity in the U.S., and they were eager to get to work right away in the U.S. and contribute to our country. And many of the folks were planning to join family and community members who are already in the United States. As I mentioned on the screen, the top left is our group, Aaron Nujamian Esquejada, Zan Weber, myself, and Christina Duran, one of our colleagues here at IINE, who is from Nogales, Arizona, a border community, grew up on the border, families from Mexico, and she was on the trip with us as well. There's a picture on the top right of us meeting with Annunciation House. That's an organization, a shelter in El Paso, Texas. They run a number of shelters, and they take people in once they cross the southern border, and they're there, as they said to us, to help people on the move. People oftentimes coming north to places like Massachusetts. The bottom left is a camp run by the city of Ciudad Juarez. That's on the Mexican side, and that's where some families stay. The shelters, by the way, in Ciudad Juarez, when we were there in July, were half full, and that's where people wait for their Customs Border Protection application interview. And the bottom right is a welcoming message, I think, reminding us that nearly all of us have immigrants in our family history, and that all of us at one point or other in our family have been welcomed to this country, even those who are currently denouncing immigrants in this campaign.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think, as you said, rather than experiencing what we had heard was a really chaotic border, what really struck us was how calm the border seemed to be. But unfortunately, the more people we talked to, the more we realized that level of calm is really masking a very different reality underneath it. And the more people we talked to, the more we realized how dangerous the journey from the southern border of Mexico to its northern border and our southern border has become, particularly because the U.S. is now requiring that people who want to ask for permission for asylum at our border have to sign up for through an application for an appointment. And that appointment, because there are so few appointments available, can take anywhere between 8 and 12 months for somebody to receive. And in that time, even if someone is fleeing and has a life-threatening reason to get into the US quickly, they have to wait for nearly 3/4, sometimes a full year in Mexico before they're even given an appointment. So can you tell us a little bit about what that wait looks like?
Well, the wait is one in which people are in Mexico. They don't necessarily have a right to work, although Mexico's trying to help people. The Mexican people that we've met with, the groups that we met with, are trying to help people get the right to work in that country. So oftentimes they're waiting in a shelter, and they are exploited. We had several people actually said it was easier to cross the Darien Gap. It was a more organized process to cross the Darien Gap than it was to go through Mexico, because the United States government has outsourced a lot of its border protection to the country of Mexico. And Mexico is trying to keep people as far south as possible, not near the U.S. border, the northern border of Mexico. So we spoke to migrants and we spoke to aid groups on both sides of the border. We spoke to people at the International Office of Migration, which is a division of the United Nations. We spoke to people at basically the equivalent, the Ciudad Juarez equivalent of the Massachusetts Office of Refugees and Immigrants, who told us straight up that people trying to cross through Mexico were paying bribes to Mexican officials, to government officials, and they were also paying money to cartels and criminal groups. So on the other side, they were trying to stay alive while they waited, as Zan said, many, many months for their Customs Border and Protection application appointments.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll mention is that, in speaking with service providers and families themselves that were trying to cross, we learned that in particular, Black migrants and those with LGBTQ identities and status were facing additional discrimination all along their journey, as well as in the application process to enter the country.
So if if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the new presidential order. So President Biden issued an interim final rule on June 4th, 2024. It became the final rule in September. And this rule is actually stricter than the border bill in terms of once border crossings reach 2,500 people a day, and which it was at when President Biden issued this order, the border is basically shut down. It makes it very, very difficult for people to make asylum claims. And Customs Border Protection staff, Border Patrol agents are turning back people quickly. So this resulted in a very, very quiet border. Right now, as Dan said, when we were there, it was a very quiet border. There were not a lot of crossings.
Right. I think what we heard from the Biden administration in enacting this rule and restriction on asylum was that they were opening new, more legal, more controlled, safer pathways from countries for people to come to the U.S., specifically under that Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan program that we mentioned, through which about over 500,000 people have come into the U.S. through humanitarian parole. The challenge is that the border has been asylum's been restricted, and that program that had been introducing people in a really sort of safe and orderly way to the U.S. is not going to be renewed, which we heard from this administration just this past month. And that means that for everybody who has come to the U.S., many of whom we have helped, the entire state of Massachusetts has helped. There are many people in our shelter system. There are many people in our workforce. There are many people we've invested in. If the U.S. doesn't renew humanitarian status, all of those people's status and ability to remain in the U.S. will be in jeopardy. And beyond that, the people who are here, who are working, they're filling our labor shortages, they're contributing to their communities around New England. And if we reverse parole and we make it impossible for them to stay, we're really going to be risking losing out on all of the contributions that they have made to date and all of the investment that we have offered them.
So we made a number of recommendations, and before I go, I just want to share a few little anecdotes of the trip. We had a chance to meet with asylum seekers, and as I mentioned earlier, in each case, they were people that could detail their persecution, and they had been struggling for months to get as far as they got to, which was Ciudad Juarez, right on the border. We also had a chance to walk around. If you just remember back in March of 2023, I think it was then, there was a fire in Ciudad Juarez, and 40 men were killed. They were in a detention facility. They were waiting for their Customs Border Protection interviews. They were placed there by the Mexican government. Fire broke out. Most of the people in that shelter were killed, sadly. And we walked around that site, and it was barren. There was no memorial, no plaque, nothing to remember those individuals. And that was a stark reminder of the consequences of the policies that we adopt in the United States, how they can harm people on the southern border, south of our border, how they can lead to a loss of life and quite a bit of tragedy. So with that said, we made the following recommendations in this report. The report is called Las Mariposas de la Frontera, and mariposas is butterfly, and that's an important symbol throughout Mexican culture. And mariposas, we picked that because mariposas cross the border. I believe the U.S. government should rescind that executive order entirely. We don't think it's lawful. It is being challenged in court. It's still the law of the land, but we think it has created a very dangerous situation for people south of the border who are desperate to come here. We think there are better ways to manage the border. Aside from this, we are advocating for an increase in available CBP1 application appointments. This could shorten the entry process and alleviate congestion. That congestion at the border, as I said, and as Zan said, is causing people to be in great harm. We also recommend that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice provide nationality-specific data of the app's usage to help ensure there's equitable use across populations. What we saw, Zan and I and our colleague Cristina Duran and Aaron, we saw at the state of Chihuahua's Office of Refugees and Immigrants, the equivalent of what we have here in Massachusetts, people at the table filling out the CBP1 applications, the Customs Border and Protection 1 application, and not being able to access it because the software on their iPhone couldn't access it. We want specific data of the app's usage to assure that there's equitable usage across populations. And lastly, we believe strongly that we have to stop pushbacks by the Mexican government. This is leading to fraud. It's leading to people spending money on bribes that they don't have. It's putting people in debt. We've actually met people here in the United States and our services who owe money to some of the people that helped them cross the border, and they're in fear for their lives here in the United States. And so we are urging the Mexican government, the United States government, to force the Mexican government to stop the pushbacks. And Mexico will listen because 70% of their economy depends on trade with the United States. So no matter who wins the presidential election next week, IINE will remain focused on securing greater rights and equality for refugees and immigrants.
Thanks, Jeff. And now I'm going to turn back to Bill. I'd like to just pull our conversation down to a more local level. And Bill, as Jeff mentioned, you were the chair of IINE's board of directors in the early 2000s. You rejoined us earlier this year in a new position for us as director of public policy and advocacy. You have deep experience in immigration, in law, and education. But we'd like to hear from you directly. Just talk a little bit about what's the focus of your role.
Well, thanks, Ann. And as you mentioned, this is a new role necessitated by the growth at IINE, and it's really becoming an important and leading voice for refugee and immigrant rights and support within Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And in this role, I'm focused on a few priorities: providing input to policy decision makers, building support for IINE and for refugees and immigrants within the states, and also coordinating with our partner resettlement agencies and other immigrant support agencies in advocacy efforts and our overall support.
Yeah. Honestly, this role has come just in time. We have been hugely impacted by new policies and flows and waves of immigration in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And let's just start with Massachusetts. What are you seeing at our local and our state level?
Well, much of the focus right now is on immigrant families who came here primarily from Central and South America over the past year. When they arrived, due to the crisis in affordable housing, it's impacting all the state residents and particularly the new arrivals. So these families had no choice but to enter emergency shelters and overflow sites. Now, today, these shelters and sites are at capacity. There are additional short-term shelters, but new arrivals can only stay there for very short periods of time. And the state government is actively discouraging immigrants from coming here to the extent that they can, unless they have a guaranteed place to stay with a sponsor or otherwise.
Yeah. And like Jeff said, we've served over 20,000 people, 14,000 of whom are Haitian, some of whom are in the emergency shelter program, and as well as being in our services. They're homeless, they're in the shelter program, they're in our services. How is the Institute responding to the state shelter policy and its changes?
Sure. Last year, we led a coalition of 8 Massachusetts-based resettlement agencies to secure funds from the Massachusetts legislature to apply our successful refugee resettlement model to helping other immigrant families move from shelters into permanent housing, and then providing them support to find employment and achieve self-sufficiency. It's a challenging task, particularly because of the shortage in affordable housing. In addition, there are many parties and systems involved in the process of moving families out of the shelters and into apartments. And while we're dealing with that, the rules about how long they can stay in short-term shelters are changing. That said, we're making progress. We've moved numerous families into apartments, and this is such an important step in getting them on the path to stability and self-sufficiency.
Thanks. I'd also point out, I mean, this has been some of the hardest work that we have done recently, but the advocacy efforts are really guided by our enduring belief across the last 100 years that Massachusetts in particular has been really a beacon of welcome for immigrants, and that our state is much stronger because of it. And just on that topic, let's turn to one more question that we have for everyone, which is the question of how do immigrants affect our communities? Lots of politicians tell us that immigration should make us nervous, especially because new arrivals, quote, steal American jobs. But what is the reality of that? And our question is, how do immigrants affect the labor market for the native-born US workers? And the responses you can choose from are, 1, they have no impact on the labor market for US-born workers. 2, they take jobs away from US-born workers. 3, they lead to lower wages across all sectors of our economy. And 4, they often complement US-born workers by filling gaps in the labor market and driving economic growth. So again, I'll just give you a few moments to respond. So the correct answer is number 4. According to really years and years of extensive research and data, the foreign-born workers and immigrants often complement the US-born workers and fill gaps in our labor market and our economy. This is not to say that there aren't other impacts of immigration on our economy, on our school systems, on our social welfare systems, but it is to say there's no correlation between what that's been proven between the impact of immigration on federal policies and in our labor market.
You know, Zan, we see this very clearly in Massachusetts, and particularly in Boston. Immigrants make up around 30% of Boston's labor force. They fill critical roles in healthcare, construction, biotech, and other industries. 28% of Boston's residents are immigrants, and many more are children of immigrants, including our mayor, Michelle Wu. And nationwide, the same story. Foreign-born individuals compose 58% of doctoral level computer and mathematical scientists, for example, and about 70% of agricultural workers. Immigrants are an essential part of our economy, promoting prosperity and growth.
Thanks, Bill. And I do think one of the greatest sources or messages around misinformed messages, and we don't talk enough about how important immigrants are for our economy, and particularly in Massachusetts, even for the ability of our economy to keep growing and our population to keep growing, because without immigrants, we would have a net negative outmigration rate. But now let's shift to New Hampshire. What's your policy work been and involved this year in New Hampshire?
Well, immediately after I arrived in April, the first focus was on a bill that had come from the New Hampshire House that was attempting to restrict driver's licenses for a group of immigrants. The bill was problematic for a number of reasons. First, immigrants they were targeting included refugees and asylees who are fully authorized to live and work in the United States and in New Hampshire. Second, the bill's sponsors argued that letting more citizens have licenses would give them an avenue to vote, but the reality is that this is a non-issue. There are only a handful of incidents of non-citizen voting nationwide over the past 40 years. And third, we need immigrants in the workforce. We want immigrants to be in the workforce and to be self-sufficient. And particularly in New Hampshire, if they can't drive, they can't get to work and they can't fill those jobs where they're desperately needed. We spoke with senators, testified before the Senate committee, and thankfully that bill is now on indefinite hold.
Thanks, Bill. I know you from living in New Hampshire and us from our work there for so long that we get calls every single day from employers who are looking for workers, and they're not offering a way to get to work, but they are offering a job. So now I'm going to invite Jeff back, and we're just going to open up the conversation to questions from our audience. And our first question actually is for you, Bill. You addressed the false argument that immigrants take jobs from from US born citizens, but what about housing? For housing in all of New England, now across the country, is so tight. Is it a valid concern to be worried that newcomers are limiting affordable housing for people already here?
The housing shortage is really due to a number of factors, and immigration is a very minor part of that. Rising costs for rental housing, mortgage affordability and availability. The reduced supply of affordable housing is also related to new real estate investors and a greater demand in higher income markets. Studies have shown that there's no relationship between cities with the greatest immigration during the pandemic and cities with the greatest increase in housing prices. And finally, we note that immigrants are a significant contributor to the construction workforce, and losing them would only worsen the housing shortage.
Interesting. Okay, Jeff, the next question is for you. We've all read false claims about immigrants and crime. How do I, as an individual, and this person asking, combat the myth of the migrant crime wave when I hear that?
Well, there are two things that I would say. There are studies that show unequivocally that immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than native-born Americans, and study after study has shown this. And then there's the logic that you can say to friends and neighbors, and that is that why would anyone who came to the United States, who understands that if they commit a crime, a serious crime especially, they can be deported from this country, why would anyone kind of take a risk on doing something, committing a criminal act? Not saying that immigrants and refugees don't commit crimes. There's data that they do, but they do it at a lower rate, a much lower rate than U.S. residents and U.S. citizens. And the studies show it, and the logic behind it backs it up.
Thanks, Jeff. I think we were just reading that, I think a new report just came out that immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than native-born folks. And I know that, we sort of had this reality check when we visited the border. And what we found was, a 2,000-mile wide, open-eyed situation that basically it turns a blind eye to human suffering. Almost every person that we saw attempting to cross the border was either doing so because they were desperate, or they were fleeing violence, or they were fleeing persecution. So I'm going to go to our next question. If the US does decide to significantly limit immigration, what would it mean for the average citizen? Would we feel an impact? Either one of you.
I'll start. And then Bill can add some more information. So, the answer is yes. We do not have enough workers in our industries certainly in New England. We have, Massachusetts right now, 185,000 job openings that are not going to be filled by folks that were born here. We're going to need new people to come into this area and work. We also, if you look at many of our industries, they depend heavily on foreign-born talent. We don't have enough scientists. We don't have enough doctors in our system right now. We don't have enough medical professionals. So we need foreign-born talent to come into the United States. Also, if you want to talk about, other parts of the United States, including Massachusetts, by the way, New Hampshire, but certainly other parts of the United States rely heavily on foreign-born workers to work in the agricultural industry. And if you don't allow folks into this country, we will see higher prices for everyday goods, food, services, milk, bread, eggs, all sorts of things. So the cost of living, if immigrants don't come in, will increase.
Yeah, that's true, Jeff. The U.S. Is one of the few countries in what we consider the Western world, or the advanced developed world, that's actually increasing in population. And that is driven largely by immigrants and the families and children of immigrants. Without that, we face a much higher level of economic stagnation and a loss of prosperity and growth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last thing I'll mention is so much of immigration is what Trump calls chain migration, but what is otherwise known as family reunification. So the impact to so many millions of families of having borders closed and immigration restricted would be both personal and devastating. Okay, one more question. Given how polarizing the topic of immigration has become, do you have any hope that Americans can find common ground?
Look, I'm always optimistic that we can find common ground. I think it was Winston Churchill who said, Americans will always do the right thing only after they've tried everything else first. And so I think that, it is in our own economic best interest to have an organized, well-managed immigration system. And I think actually the polls show that Americans want an immigration system that is fair and well-managed. Fair and well-managed. That's important to them. And they do put border security high on the list. That's what's evolved. But I do think, yes, I do think policies can come together because businesses need people. Our farms, our factories need people to work. Our cities, towns need people to work in them. Healthcare needs people to work. So I think the economic argument eventually will result in people across the country coming to consensus. And I think, I can't guarantee what will happen in the next election, but I do think the border bill that almost passed, which some of us didn't like because of the high restrictions on asylum, that bill is actually based on people coming together out of economic reasons.
I guess the one other thing I'll mention is if there's any upside to the limitations on asylum that have been put in place, it may be that if average Americans feel more comfortable with, and what we saw, a very controlled border, no chaos, really calm, there may be the opening, the window of a dialogue to actually separate out border control and the sort of threats that people experience, baseless or not, and immigration policy reform and what we really need as a country and how to pair places in the country with the people who need people with the people who would like to come. Okay, we do have one more question that just came in. Do you think providing sponsorship for families in shelter might give some protection from deportation? And could IINE play a role in connecting those already here with volunteer sponsors?
I mean, certainly we could play a role in trying to connect people with volunteer sponsors for sure. So if there's folks who are watching who would like to become community sponsors for a family that we exit from the shelter system, we have a contract all the resettlement agencies do in the state to exit people from the shelters, immigrant families from shelters. And should their protections run out, there's you have to go through a legal process too. You have to file a pro se asylum application that helps them to stay in the country longer. You have to try to help them to get temporary protective status. All that could end under a new president. And so they are in much better shape, folks, if they have a sponsor, but it's not a guarantee they can stay in the United States. That's a complicated legal question. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that the immigrants in the shelters, they're not all under one status or here for one reason. They have different statuses. They have different permissions to stay in the U.S. Certainly sponsorship and having a family supporting them and helping them on the path to self-sufficiency is great, but it doesn't necessarily affect their legal status here.
And I'll say, and I'm going to say this too at the end, if anybody wants to help us and get involved, but by sponsoring families in our shelter program otherwise, or even just talking to us about what could be supportive, please, please, please get in touch with us. We welcome your input. Like Bill said, I do think a lot of legal status is based on immigration policy, and the most important support somebody can get at this point who has humanitarian parole is support for legal help to adjust their status, either to temporary protective status, to claim asylum, or other pathways available. It's going to be a hard, I think, expensive personal journey for each and every person who is losing humanitarian parole and doesn't want to leave.
Yeah, and I might also say, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Bill was at a clinic the other day. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts has stepped up and has done a lot of work. It's actually under the direction of our colleague at the Office of Refugees and Immigrants here, Susan Church, to help people with legal matters, help people adjust their status in the United States. We have a contract, our organization, and many others do too, to help people apply for pro se asylum, which keeps them in the country longer while their asylum claim is pending. Also to help people get employer authorization documents. Many of the people you're seeing in the shelters here in Massachusetts were lawfully admitted to the United States of America, but not with permission to work. And so they require assistance to get assistance and authorization to work. The state of Massachusetts has stepped up in a big way to make that possible. And I think the state sees that as investment, as an investment that will pay back in terms of people hopefully staying in our state, contributing to the community, working here, paying taxes, being good citizens, good residents, good neighbors.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Dan, if I can, I'll also point out that there's a relatively new program that we call Resettle Together that allows private individuals and groups of private individuals to directly sponsor refugee families coming to the U.S. And this is something that's been relatively common in some other countries, but fairly new here to the U.S. And so that does give people who want to be directly involved in refugee resettlement an opportunity to make a huge difference in the lives of an individual family.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out, Bill. And I'll just say again, and I'm going to say again, we have a lot of different ways people can get involved. So we actually have had several more questions come in. This is a fantastic audience. Our next question is, how can employers, especially in the service and agricultural sectors, push the immigration agenda?
I think the most important thing is to speak out to legislators and community members, friends and neighbors about the truth about immigration. There's a great book, by the way, by Zeke Hernandez. He's a professor at the Wharton School in Philadelphia, and it's called The Truth About Immigration. And Zeke spoke to all of the resettlement agencies in Massachusetts this summer. And, he talked about the fact that employers are the ones begging for immigrants and workers in general, and anyone to fill some of the jobs they have open. And oftentimes they'll call this agency, they'll call us up and say, do you have anyone who can do X, Y, and Z tomorrow morning? And so, that takes a little bit of work. You've got to train people. You've got to teach them some English so they can undertake direction. We need to invest in folks when they come here. So I think what employers can say is to politicians and others is, we need immigrants in this country. My business depends on immigrants in this country. And it is important that the state government and federal government invest in immigrants and refugees by making classes available to them so they can learn English, and by helping them to navigate the job world and get into the job market, because it's not easy for someone new to this country to do. So I think that's what you just need to say the truth. And one thing that came up in the conversation with Professor Hernandez this summer was that a reason, I'm not sure he said this, but it was a conclusion I reached, was that, reason why so many people in the political world are lying about immigrants and refugees is because when you look at the data, we can't run the country without them. And so the only way you can kind of, make these people your enemy is by saying things that are untrue and lying. But the fact of the matter is, the country can't grow, and we can't grow the economy in this area, especially without newcomers.
Yeah, I'll also note that by and large, in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, particularly at the federal level, our legislators have been very supportive of immigration. They've been very supportive of our efforts and the efforts of the groups similar to ours, and reaching out to them and reminding them that they should continue to be so is important and does make a difference. And obviously we have an election coming up, but as I said, the federal legislators in particular have been very supportive.
We have a question here. Will we share any upcoming TPS or pro se asylum clinics? This person says, I have many clients who I think could benefit. And yes, we will definitely be able to share that. There's, like Jeff said, there are clinics happening that are very well organized, that are happening all across the state now in an attempt to get everybody who has humanitarian parole and the option of temporary protective status to apply in a professional way, in a successful way, for protective status. Bill, is there anything else you wanted to say about attending one of those clinics and supporting?
Well, the current clinics that Mira is running are specifically for shelter residents. But if you check the Mira website, there are clinics across the state. They are coming up, and they're open to a broader population. So it's really just looking for those as they are available. But
Yes.
as I said, right now we're dealing specifically with shelter residents to help them get the status they need and the opportunity to work and get out of the shelters.
All right, here's, I think maybe one last question, and it's not an easy one. What would you say to a naturalized citizen whose relatives have been waiting years to be able to come to the US through family reunification, and who consequently resent those who get immediate resettlement by coming to the southern border?
I would say to folks that, our immigration system is not perfect. It's a very, we say it's a broken immigration system, and that's an example of it. That we have people that have been waiting for years to come here through family reunification. At the same time, there are people that have been admitted for humanitarian purposes. The difference, every single family situation is different. The difference with President Biden's program that was just stopped, but for Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan individuals and families, the president was allowing 7,500 people from each of those nationalities per month to come to the United States through a sponsor program. And he did that because those folks were facing persecution back home. They were facing immediate persecution back home. And so the United States has a longstanding policy and practice of providing humanitarian protection to people who need it. And so that's the difference. Obviously, we don't know the circumstances of the folks who have that feeling. There is that kind of resentment. We've seen that. Mike Madrid wrote a book called the Latino Century. He's a founder of the Lincoln Project and has worked in presidential campaigns. And one of the things that he found, and he's from Mexico, but his family is, but one of the things that he found in his research is that many people will say, why are they allowed in when my family had to wait? And all I can say is it's an imperfect system.
Yeah, but let's be clear too. Asylum seekers are not given, permanent residence when they show up at the border. Yeah, they're put into a queue. They are going to have an asylum hearing. We're not putting them back into a situation that in most cases is life-threatening to them. We're going to let them into the country, and then they're going to have to prove that they have a right to be here, many of which are denied that. So they're not taking places away from people coming in the family reunification or in other ways, nor are they giving immediate full status here.
Good point.
Yeah, thank you both. Those are really important responses. And I'll just add, the Institute is priority, a human services provider. We will work with anybody who shows up who we can support. We're really hoping for, like Jeff said, humane immigration policy reform, so that we make a commitment to people that we can carry through the commitment with, and that we give people the opportunity to present themselves and ask for asylum. Like we said before, less than half the people who take the long journey to get to the US and actually get the opportunity to ask ever get asylum. Okay, with that, I'm gonna close the questions, and we just have one more slide that we're gonna show that's more details about how you can help. Thank you so much, Jeff and Bill. This evening, we have some very specific ways that you can help. One is you've really already been a part of this, speaking out, advocating on behalf of refugees and immigrants. Every town hall, we say how important it is to talk to your legislators about how you feel about what's happening in immigration policy reforms. There's a very specific bill that was introduced by Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey called the Destination Reception Assistance Act that would offer states and cities that are taking in a lot of families, migrant families and individuals, more federal resources to support them, so that the states themselves weren't scrambling for resources or having to thin resources out across all of their support systems. The second is calling for more pathways to citizenship. We haven't talked about this in this presentation, but even Afghans who are here having fled the Taliban through humanitarian parole do not have a permanent status yet. Each and every one of those people who came into the US are still fighting for permanency to stay in the US, despite how changed Afghanistan has become and how dangerous it would be for them to return. Similarly, the Ukrainian population who's here, who led the Russian invasion, does not have a permanent way to stay. These are acts that have been introduced to Congress, but they have not moved in terms of coming into law. The third is fighting for the rights of asylum seekers that we spent a lot of time tonight talking about. We really welcome you to read the report that we released, read a little bit more about our experiences, and start questioning what is happening. What do you know about what's happening at the southern border? What are the real facts? What would make sense in terms of giving people the option of asking for asylum? Second, volunteering. As we said earlier, if you are interested in sponsoring families, if you're interested in doing something a little bit more less complex, like just a one-off, taking food to someone, helping tutor them, please connect to us on our website. We have lots and lots of volunteer opportunities, both very short term as well as much longer term, to get engaged and involved in resettlement. And then finally, donating. The Institute, 30% of our budget comes from private philanthropy, people like you. And there's just absolutely no way that we could have delivered services to over 20,000 people this year without individual support. A lot of that support goes directly to impact the lives of refugees and immigrants. The cost of living in Massachusetts for those who come is skyrocketing. Everyone needs more support than we've ever seen. So we really encourage you to donate, and we're going to thank you in advance for that. And I'm just going to turn it back to Jeff to close us out, and I want to say thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank Zan and Bill and our team for putting together this webinar. We thought it was important to talk to everybody in our community, or as many people in our community as possible, about some of the issues that are being discussed in this election, especially since we actually visited a very quiet and ordered and highly funded border. One thing that was true on the border, and is true in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and New York, where we work as well, is that all around the world, there are groups of people, faith groups, individuals, community groups, nonprofit organizations for sure, that are reaching out to try to do their very best to help people who are trying to find a safe place to live and build a family and work. And so we thank everyone in the IINE community for being part of that effort, that global effort really. And we thank all of our donors and supporters for your support. And we urge you to vote if you haven't already on election day. Make your voice heard. And finally, we ask you to support, speak out, remember, tell your friends and neighbors about how important new neighbors, immigrants and refugees are to the well-being of all of us. Thank you so much.